Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back once again to Gran Turismo 7. So finally I'm getting around to doing this video. This is my final thoughts on Gran Turismo 7 Spec 2 update, or 1.40, whichever you want to call it, it really doesn't matter. So let's begin rounding up. I'm going to go through each individual point about what came along with this update and, give you my thoughts and opinions on each one as honestly as possible. Now let's start off with probably the main appeal of this update to begin with, which is the 7 brand new cars. Were they any good? Were they really, needed in the game? Did it kind of bring it in the right direction in terms of most wanted vehicles coming to the game? And I would actually go on to say yes. I think in terms of just the number themselves, it is the biggest amount of cars we've had in a single update, which kind of makes sense for a Spec 2 update. You need it to be quite a big one, but I'd say in terms of the cars themselves and the selection, the majority of these cars were really much wanted by the community. These were cars that you'd go on every month when Kaz releases silhouettes on Twitter to see countless people asking for, the likes of the LFA, the 190E, obviously an updated generation of Porsche 911 to the 992, and I honestly felt like it was very much a planned update in terms of the vehicles all coming as a single group. It was really kind of highlighting those cars that people mainly asked for, and they all came in a single bunch. So overall, I'd say the cars themselves were absolutely fantastic. Obviously, there wasn't any additional race car or anything like that. I know there's a bunch of the community that really does want more race cars, but I say in terms of the vehicles themselves and those being most requested, this was absolutely spot on. There was only really one kind of, I say, car of the bunch that wasn't really, I guess needed or really kind of wanted, which was the Tesla. However, if we do include that, there was pretty much something for everyone. We had European cars. We obviously had the likes of the American muscle cars coming to the game, both modern and classic, and then obviously we had the likes of the EV, if we really want to count those people that seem to absolutely love Tesla. But there is people out there that really do like those vehicles, so they really did feel overall that there was something for everyone in terms of the vehicles that came with Spec 2. Let's move on next to the track itself. Obviously, Lake Major came to the game. It was the first new track that we've had since, I believe, February of this year. So it had been a long time coming. But in terms of the track itself, it was definitely a track that not many people expected, myself included. I think we was all kind of ready for another real world track, another, road type surface track to come to the game. And obviously, this was completely out of the blue. It was a brand new original track. It was snow based, so it did bring a new surface to the game, and just overall I think it was completely different from what the majority of people were wanting. I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. I really do like Polyphony's original track design from the days previous, so really anything from GT Sport onwards has not been that great in my opinion, but harking back to the days of Midfield Raceway and all that kind of good stuff, they've absolutely presented some amazing tracks over the years. And I'd definitely say, just in terms of the atmosphere when it came to my opinions on the track, I kind of compared it to the likes of Grindelwald. It was very much a picturesque track, very beautiful, very nice to look at, felt full of personality and quirky little things kind of around the whole event. Overall, I'd say from a design standpoint, it was absolutely fantastic. It was visually stunning, full of life. It really felt like a kind of old original track in terms of the way it presented itself. Obviously, we then have the inclusion of snow coming to the game, obviously brought alongside it the snow tires themselves. I do think this was a great thing, again, because it was just not expected to see a completely new surface come to the game. It was absolutely fantastic, but again, it did kind of leave me wanting more. It is still an off-road track, very limited in terms of how much you can actually do with those. I would have definitely preferred maybe a original road track, or at least maybe a real world proper motorsport circuit track. So definitely just in terms of the longevity of this track, should I say, I don't think it will necessarily stick around too long, but in terms of the way it presented itself, in terms of the way it played and it being an original track, it really did feel like a massive step up from what we've seen previous to this in terms of Polyphony's original tracks. They've definitely kind of dropped the ball, I'd say, in my opinion, ever since around about GT Sport. Anything prior to that, like Autumn Ring, midfield and such were absolutely fantastic. It did feel like a bit of a throwback to those days of old. So we did get a new track. It was good. It was, you know, not absolutely a standout, but it was definitely something a little bit different, and I did quite like the surprise. But definitely the longevity is probably what's going to let this track down in the long run. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a cluster here. There's going to be a bunch of different, I guess, individual points mixed into one. I'm going to kind of class this as the event category. So anything from license tests, events themselves, custom race payouts and all that stuff, I'll kind of put into a single category. So let's start off with perhaps the most minute one of all these, the license tests. This was something that nobody really expected. We got obviously 50 new license tests in the form of the master licenses. I definitely say this was, again, like I said, something that wasn't expected, but a nice little surprise for me. You know, Gran Turismo and license tests kind of go hand in hand. I know they can be very frustrating and stuff, but I'd say overall this was a much better improvement from what we saw in the base license tests. I just felt they were always a little bit maybe too easy and just not as rewarding as they should have been. I think the best reward we got from the originals was the Red Bull X 2019. From this though, we end up getting a lot more cars and prize cars that are worth, you know, a ton more money and just feel a lot more special. Anything ranging from a, you know, 1930s Ford Roadster all the way up to the McLaren MP 4-4. Obviously absolutely fantastic in terms of the prize rewards, and I'd definitely say, although they were unexpected, they were much better in terms of the original license tests, if not a little bit too easy to be called master license tests. They really weren't too difficult. A couple of hours and you probably have these done and dusted. Moving on, next we'll move on to the events themselves. I'll just quickly touch on these. I think in terms of the overall way they were presented and the, I guess, differences that we saw across the board. Obviously there was an absolute ton of them, the most events we've ever received in a single update, but definitely they were just a better direction. They were more mixed up than the typical start you know, half a lap down and you have to go and chase up. There were even events where you had to start in first place. There were events in the rain, in the snow, obviously on the new track. Just overall, I felt like the, I guess, quality of the events were much better from the norm, and I hope this becomes the normal way that Polyphony start treating these events. Alongside this as well, we also saw the addition of weekly events coming to the game, or weekly challenges, whatever you want to call them. It doesn't really matter. These were definitely quite an interesting thing, and while the rewards seem to have kind of dwindled away a little bit in recent weeks, I'd definitely say after probably the third week it just kind of dropped off, and it was just mainly credit rewards, which I'm not usually a fan of, and I'll kind of mention that later on, because there was so much money rolling around GT7 this update because of a certain thing that, you know, it kind of became irrelevant. But overall, in terms of actually enticing players to come back each week, in terms of the single player content, get rewarded for taking maybe an hour of their time out to complete these events and being able to kind of experience different vehicles and maybe cars they haven't touched, weekly events are absolutely fantastic, and it's definitely one of the best features to come along this update. Now next up we have custom race payouts. Now these obviously got changed. At first they were broken, as we all know, that kind of absolutely got glitched to the limit, really. But you know, they did kind of get repatched with update 1.41, and again that did kind of a knock-on effect with Sophy as well, improving that AI, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But in terms of the custom race payouts, this is what we've been asking for a long time, is just to make them more worthwhile to the player. I always felt that in terms of the custom events themselves, originally they were just very poor. You know, there was no point to go there. There was no reason to make these weird and wacky events, but now we actually do seem to get at least a decent reward. And whilst it's definitely been, you know, patched quite a bit with update 1.41, it is definitely a much better experience than it was, you know, prior to that. And with most people probably having the majority of the cars now because of the money glitches and stuff, I honestly think this is kind of opening up a whole new playground of absolutely ridiculous events that we can perform within GT7. Much needed in terms of the custom race payouts. Do I wish it was still a little bit more? Of course, but again, you know, overall it did do essentially what we asked for, so I really cannot complain there. So finally, alongside this update, we saw the return of Sophy AI. Now, I believe the last time this appeared was either February or March of this year, in very much a, I guess, different form. Obviously, the cars had very specific parameters to them. It was very specific tracks, and basically we just saw a beta of the full release of Sophy with this update. So there was a lot more tracks involved, a lot more open in terms of your car choice, a lot more AI on track at the same time. It was just a very impressive feature, and we obviously got our first look at Sophy. Now, originally it was broken, obviously, alongside this I guess glitch that was going around with the money and stuff. It did affect the performance of Sophy. Obviously, once 1.41 rolled around, you could essentially use more than a standard vehicle, and overall I would say this is a great addition. It really is the kind of the future of single player racing AI. It's great to see what's going on with this AI itself. It's great to race against it. On the high difficulties, it really does provide a challenge. It will, perform like a real world player, but obviously much more cleaner usually. A lot less dive bombing and stuff that we've seen from it previous. I just felt overall this was a fantastic addition to the game, and something that was desperately needed. We all know that the Gran Turismo AI is absolutely terrible, so to see what the potential of Sophy AI is in terms of making the single player racing actually fun, I'm very interested to see where this goes in the future, and maybe into future releases of the Gran Turismo series. There's a lot of potential there, and I can only see this getting stronger. So let's move on to my final point of this update video, rounding up with obviously the notorious money glitch. Well, it was kind of obvious I couldn't necessarily round up this without touching on the money glitch itself. So obviously this was around for a good few weeks at the start of this update. Obviously it has been patched and altered. It is still kind of there. There was multiple ways to run it. We had basically a bunch of low performance point engine swap vehicles running around AFK or non-AFK, however you wanted to run it, earning upwards of 5.5 million credits per hour, which is rather quite ridiculous. But it was definitely a period of time where everyone in Gran Turismo 7, in terms of those that want to collect the cars and stuff, really could take advantage of this. Most people were, absolutely stacking up the credits, getting 100 mil, and then obviously just waiting for the cars to drop and just purchasing them, and obviously then going again with the AFK methods and such. And it really did feel like a good time in Gran Turismo 7. Now, I obviously don't think this was intentional. I know there's a bunch of people that seem to think Polyphony do this intentional for players to find and then obviously take advantage of before getting rid of it and patching it, to bring a bit more of the audience back. I honestly don't see it in that way. I just think they really do kind of overlook some of the things that can be sort of used and abused in GT7. It's always kind of been that way. They kind of fix one thing and then another thing breaks. Do I think, though, that this is the end of money glitches, obviously, since this went on to get patched? No. It's pretty, regular that a money glitch will pop up in GT7, or just something will get changed and then it will just somehow lead to it being absolutely abused. But I do think overall this was a great thing for the game. I honestly think not only was update 1.40 so big and really kind of hyped up, and when people saw what was coming to the game and the quality of life changes we were getting, obviously the hype was there. This kind of added to the momentum. People were able to finally get that money they wanted, finally finish up buying those 20 mil cars or the 10 mil cars and stuff, and really kind of take advantage of this. And I don't really see a downside to it. It was just a great time for Gran Turismo players. People were able to finally get those cars and enjoy them the way they should. Once you've then completed all your car collection or got all the cars you realistically want, you can then essentially just go and do what you want. Custom races are much better now overall, so you can make these weird and wacky grids full of all sorts and everything really, and kind of play to your heart's content. So I do feel like overall the money glitch was a good thing for the game. I know some people view it as cheating and all that kind of stuff. Look, I really don't care. It is what it is. You're in the single player portion of the game. You're not hurting anyone. You're just collecting your cars and doing what you want with them, which is the way this game should be. And in all honesty, I honestly think that's the way the game should be. In terms of the single player, give us ways to earn that money. Let us just have fun and play to our heart's content and make these weird and wacky races, full of absolute ridiculous millions worth of machinery, and just let us play around with these custom races and stuff. And that's kind of what it felt like this money glitch did. It allowed players to just do what they want in the game without the restriction of money or anything like that. And overall, it just felt like a damn good time in GT7. So overall, was Spec 2 any good for Gran Turismo 7? Yes. I honestly think this was a superb update. I felt like it did everything that it should have done. Whilst there's still a few things left that I really want to see changed, and I'll kind of speak about that tomorrow, speaking about where I feel like this game should go in the future. Overall, I felt like in terms of the quality of life and the amount of features that this update brought, it was much better than I think we really expected. I guess we expected a bigger update coming towards the World Finals and the end of the year. It'd been long overdue, and after the absolute slog through the mid-year of terrible updates, Spec 2 really did stand out as, Polyphony, if they really want to, can produce some very, very good content. They really can change up the whole game, and that's the thing as well. Overall, I felt like this changed up the game, just enough to feel like a proper Spec 2 update. I don't think they held back too much. I still think there's, like I said, a few things that need changing, but I definitely say in terms of the quality of life of the game and just the longevity of this game is much more improved. And I do think Spec 2 kind of, succeeded in what it aimed to do. Build up hype around GT7 once again, bring players back, just make the game overall a much better product than what we'd seen for, 18 months or so prior to this. So yeah, overall, a great update. I don't think it was absolutely perfect by any means, but I do think it is a step in the right direction. And if Polyphony can keep this momentum going, then, who knows where GT7 can end up. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.